Mozambique during one, they're always susceptible to very severe flooding. This is during one of those floods, and much of it is a floodplain. And many of the families there may be plenty of food in the country. They don't have access because they're cut off, and their own food has been destroyed, so they don't have available food, and they don't have access to other parts of the country that may have food. Food utilization, and that's the way the body makes the most of the nutrients in the food. So that's you being able to process it. If you have severely malnourished, undernourished children like this, again, if you suddenly bring in food that's very high in nutrients or a shock to their system, or they may have other things going on health-wise, parasites or disease and so forth. That's the health aspect, that's the water and sanitation aspect. It may not just be food that's the problem here. So food utilization, you have to be able to process and use the food sufficiently. And then the last one, stability of the other three over time. So that no matter what, no matter if there's a shock in the system, you have an earthquake, you have a conflict, civil unrest, that you still have available food, you have access to it, and you're able to utilize it. So that's what it is when we talk about food security. Any questions or comments on that? Does that make sense? So looking at, going back to FAO then relating to that, one way FAO deals with these emergencies and dealing with food security is through one of their strategic objectives, which is on resilience, which was the last one of the 5. And further elaborating on the resilience aspect, it's to enhance rural people's resilience to human and natural disasters by protecting and rehabilitating agriculture-based livelihoods. So that's pretty much in a nutshell what their programs aim to do. But why agriculture and livelihoods in emergencies? I mentioned earlier that that's their mandate. And emergencies, when we think emergency, we think life-saving, pulling people out of rubble, or emergency health or medical support, or emergency water and sanitation or shelter. Where does agriculture and livelihoods come in? Why would we even be talking about that in an emergency? Because the longer-term recovery is absolutely essential. Okay, so when does that start then? When does the recovery start? Does that start right away with when the emergency occurs?
Not when you're pulling people out of the rubble.
Okay.
It is a concern from the beginning.
Sure. Okay. Good. Other comments related to that? Yes.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Haiti as that example, I guess. There's, 5,000 NGOs, and yet poverty is absolutely amazing. And I think it is because the systems there have not, the governmental system really has been disempowered by the NGOs, and also by the wealthy who take more than their fair share. And I read a book a while ago about Somalia, The Road to Hell, and it was talking about how the U.S. agricultural aid is from corporate farmers here, so free food is dumped, in this case in Somalia. The people who organize that system get paid very well, and what it really causes is corruption, because the food is used by those empowered to support their own interests. And it seems to me that we don't do all that well with those two issues.
Okay.
And I'd be interested in what your viewpoint is on it.
Sure. You're absolutely right, and there's been a lot of pushback with that, and part of the thing in terms of programming with a lot of the UN agencies, and one dealing mostly with food, usually FAO's dealing on the production side and capacity building and so livelihoods. World Food Program deals primarily with the food aid, but even they are going to systems whereby they're trying to purchase more locally, or there's also cash, they're using vouchers. Voucher system in cases where there may be food available but people don't have assets to buy because of whatever conflict or disaster. So they get a voucher to purchase whatever they need themselves. so they purchase locally from local vendors. So there are more systems like that that are being instituted to combat this very thing, because a lot of times if others, organizations, or donors come in with a lot of food aid, then that depresses the prices of food that is available there, which makes the situation worse, and farmers there then can't sell their product if there's that much free food on the market, or other people are pulling it all aside. So that's a very good point. So that's been taken into account in the way they're doing more with cash, they're doing more with these voucher programs, seed fairs, where farmers come on a particular day and can purchase seeds, tools, whatever with a voucher, and so forth. So it's trying to promote local economy and not do this, dumping that's going on. Of course, the corporate farmers aren't happy, so there's always.
I was thinking Monsanto when you were talking about the seed fairs.
Yeah. So anything else on agriculture and livelihoods? Or pop up my sentence here. Because we're dealing mostly with rural populations, and most of the countries that we're dealing with on these type of programs are agriculture-based or fishery-based. Agriculture is one of the core survival strategies for rural poor. So as was said, this is where you need to start with the recovery should start as soon as possible. I can tell you also from working with FAO on the disasters and emergencies, the time to get funding for those kind of programs for these is when the cameras are in CNN and everybody's there. That's when the money arrives, and that's when the attention is. It's not 6 months later when you're trying to do, agricultural recovery and rehabilitation and whatnot. They've moved on to the next disaster emergency or something else, and the funding won't be there. And as we know, I think we know, is that development funding is often sorely lacking, in the transitions from disasters to emergencies is often not very clear. So that's the main point there. And then the second element, talking about FAO specifically, is what they seek to do is bolster self-reliance, reduce the need for relief, and harmful coping strategies such as selling assets or getting involved in sex trade or forced migration. So being able to maintain their livelihoods, keep people in their communities, not have them migrate to the cities or somewhere else to get relief or assistance. That's ultimately what we're trying to do. Here. I should have prefaced at the beginning, even though I'm presenting on FAO, I should point out, I don't represent FAO. I'm not speaking for FAO, and I don't work currently for FAO. I work for Interworks. So I'm presenting this as someone who knows the organization from having worked there, and also from having worked with USAID, with an NGO, with private sector, and so forth. So I'm giving it from that perspective, but so don't take this as I'm speaking for FAO. Someone from FAO can come in here and tell you something totally different. So, but this is, in terms of how it works, is basically it. Just in terms of the type of disasters we're talking about, looking at, and you've seen them all over the years. Natural disasters, and we'll have a couple examples of that shortly. Food chain emergencies, and the food chain emergencies are one that are in the animal or plant realm, looking at zoonotic pest and disease, avian flu, swine flu, even now with Ebola. We'll talk a little bit about that a little later. Food safety and those things. Socioeconomic crisis, such as in 2008 with the global food price crisis in a lot of the developing world, and also the recent financial shocks and various things that go on globally. Fourth, violent conflicts and civil unrest. We have some examples of that, obviously, and that's much in the news. Is it considered an emergency that we could be dealing with? And then protracted crises, which could involve any of the above in some combination, or prolonged over time. Somalia's been going on for decades, for example, and it seems like things in the Middle East have been going on for decades, if not millennia, in some fashion. So prolonged emergencies combining some various elements of these. So what I'm going to do, I have a few short videos that kind of give examples of some of the programs so you can kind of get an idea of what these programs look like. And I've tried to select some representative examples of different countries, different continents, different types of emergencies. So the first one we'll be looking at is in South Sudan, which as probably many of you know, South Sudan became independent from Sudan and has been is continuing to have difficulties. There's much conflict and fighting primarily over resources and territory that's going on currently. And so as part of the program that FAO is involved with is providing emergency livelihood kits. And what I'd like to present, this one's only I think 2 minutes long or 3 minutes long, is note who the beneficiaries are of the different kits that they talk about, and then try and determine why talk about why they're targeted differently with the different groups.
Designed for emergency livelihood kits, which were portable, essential inputs for the 4 different kinds of livelihood systems that were in the conflict-affected states. There's a vegetable kit particularly for displaced populations that don't have much access to land, but within 30 days they can harvest their first greens. And that's a very important source of dietary diversity when there's such nutritional stress. We also have a fishing kit, which is when we've gone out and talked to the fishermen and to the women who are working with the fishermen in order to catch some fish. We know that that kit is catching between 10 and 25 kilos of fish a day. The community-based animal health workers are the long-term heroes of South Sudan. They, of course, are chosen from among the pastoralist groups and the agro-pastoralist group. They move with the livestock, so there's never a question about if you can get a community-based animal health worker restocked with the essential kit and involved in vaccine campaigns, that for sure you're going to reach areas that not in a million years I could reach. Very, very deep field locations. And then we have an essential crop kit, which basically provides, when harvested, 6 months worth of cereals and legumes for the population that has a chance of actually being able to stay in place long enough, both to cultivate, weed, take care of the crop, and harvest. So that's not for everybody because of a lot of the dislocation, but we certainly go around, we watch to see that the money that the donors have been so generous in providing to us is well spent, and that the populations that are receiving it have a way of communicating back to us that I'm happy with this, I'm not happy with that, because that's you can't just assume you know what to do.
Okay, she mentioned 4 different types of kits: vegetable kits, fishing kit, animal health kit, and crop kits. What was the distinction between the kits in terms of who they were distributed to? What did you hear, especially I think it was the first one and the last one?
Well, it was people who were like in maybe a refugee camp or somewhere displaced versus people who were living.
Okay, in this case it's displaced persons internally within the country. What was the distinction? Who got the vegetable kits?
The 30-day vegetable kit for people who were
displaced because the whole issue of they're should be temporarily situated in a camp or in a setting that's not their home. There's all kinds of land tenure issues. I mean, if they start going and planting, huge fields of long-term crops, that's not going to be set a happy precedent for those who live there, especially if they don't want them there to begin with, which is often the case. So the displaced persons got the vegetable kits so that they could grow their own food in a very small area. They could have a produce in 30 days, and that would help them nutritionally quickly. Others, if they were not displaced, were would get the crop kits. Obviously, fishermen would get the fishing kits, and those dealing in livestock and animal health would get those particular kits. So it's very targeted. No one's trying to make people that are fishermen plant vegetables, or people that grow vegetables or crops become fishermen, because ultimately those usually don't work very well. People are comfortable with what they already do in terms of their livelihood. So it's supposed to be to support their current livelihood, or in the case of a displaced person, at least give them something that they can help grow their own food in place in a camp setting. Okay. Any other comments on this particular one? Yes.
Say there's a natural disaster.
Uh-huh.
Let's say maybe the earthquake in Haiti.
Okay.
And you have a multitude of groups, NGOs that go in to do the immediate direct relief.
Mm-hmm.
How do you organize it so a family doesn't end up with, say, just a lot of agricultural related things and maybe nothing for health, or shelter, or clothing?
Okay. Usually what's done
So
depends on...
distributed more evenly, and everybody gets everything that they need.
Yeah, usually what's done in those situations, or in most disaster emergency situations, is usually a rapid needs assessment is done. Especially in natural disasters, you usually know what the primary needs are going to be for a given population, because it doesn't vary much depending on the disaster. But then doing an assessment of what their actual needs are. There's registration process that comes into place. The families have to register with the system. There's a whole coordination of the agencies, the UN, the donors, the NGOs, and so forth, and the government. Do what's called a cluster coordination system, whereby they organize by the various sectors, by agriculture, by food security, by nutrition, by health, and so forth. And then those particular agencies that work in that area, work in that particular sector, coordinate amongst themselves, both geographically in the country and as well nationally, to make sure try to minimize duplication and gaps in distribution or support to families that are needy.
So there's a lot of good communication that goes on.
Well, there should be a lot of good communication. Sometimes leaves a lot to be desired. Actually, the joke, bad joke, is that when you come in, especially early on with a big emergency like Haiti and so forth, the first few days what you see are there's a lot of meetings going on amongst the different players, the humanitarian agencies working. So on the surface, it looks like nobody's doing anything because they're all just meeting together and talking with each other. But a lot of that, while the immediate, maybe life-saving things are going on, that is the setting the foundation for coordination amongst that. Otherwise, you get people running off doing their own thing. I don't know what you're doing. You're working in water and sanitation. I'm working water sanitation, and we're going like this. So it's to make sure, and also make sure, everybody's working from the same standards. This village and community isn't getting like, everything and, TVs and, whatever. And the community over here is suffering just as badly as getting nothing. So it's to try to make sure that that's addressed. So it is a big challenge, because of as you know, disasters and emergencies are already chaotic as it is, but trying to get that, do the life-saving stuff or the immediate needs while you're also trying to coordinate is often very difficult. So it's a good question. We got another example, and this one is a bit different. The last one was looking at civil unrest and conflict. This one we're talking about HIV/AIDS in Southern Africa. It's been a big problem over the last decade or two, and in many parts of Africa, especially I think Mozambique, and that part of Southern Africa has been very particularly hard hit, that a whole generation has been wiped out, and you have a lot of cases where there's communities which are all just orphan children. All the adults are basically dead or gone. So this will be talking a little bit about that, the case in Mozambique. And this program is going to talk about establishment of junior farmer field and life schools in Mozambique, which have since been replicated in our other parts of Africa, Southern Africa, East Africa, where HIV/AIDS has been a problem. But the ultimate goal is to reduce the risk of food, nutrition, and security, protect and strengthen the livelihoods, because you've got, the adults are all gone, so whoever was training or guiding the children or teaching them how to farm and so forth were gone. So the skills and the guidance were missing. And then targeting the most vulnerable groups, that is HIV/AIDS affected, primarily the orphaned children. So this one's talking about farmer, field, and life schools in Southern Africa. This one's 15 minutes.
Buen día, buen día, buen día todos, buen día, buen día, buen día todos.
In Manica province, central Mozambique, poverty, hunger, and disease are widespread. The region is crossed by the Beira Corridor, a major transport route linking inland southern Africa to the coast. A steady flow of truckers frequenting sex workers is accelerating the spread of HIV/AIDS, and infection rates are soaring. As the disease claims more lives, growing numbers of children are left orphaned and vulnerable. Forced to fend for themselves, they risk malnutrition, disease, abuse, and sexual exploitation. Across the country, 222,000 people under the age of 19 are living with HIV/AIDS. Many more are suffering the consequences of the disease in their families and communities. And 325,000 children have already lost one or both parents to AIDS. In response to the orphan crisis, the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Program have set up an innovative schooling system known as the Junior Farmer Field and Life Schools. The philosophy is simple. Orphan children need a healthy diet, an education, and the means and confidence to make a living, if they are to have the chance of a better and safer future. Every school trains 30 orphan children between the ages of 12 and 17 in all aspects of farming, from land preparation to harvesting. Normally, they would have learned how to work the land with their parents, but AIDS is disrupting that tradition. Extension workers and school teachers provide guidance with practical field lessons. They encourage the children to learn by experimenting and observing the effects of both traditional and new techniques on crops grown in small demonstration plots.
We try to combine new technologies with the traditional knowledge of the community and of the children, without disrupting what already exists within the community. So we try and find a harmonious way to introduce innovative and effective elements and try to improve the basic knowledge they already have.
Some of the best students from last year have come back as facilitators. 16-year-old Mazwane Benjamin is enthusiastic about helping the new students because he has seen the difference the new farming techniques can make.
Before, we grew crops but with poor results. What we got from a hectare definitely wasn't going to fill up a warehouse. But this knowledge is going to help me. Now that we plant in rows, a small patch of land can give us a lot of food. So this knowledge is really going to help me in the future.
Once they master the new techniques, the children have something to offer to their community and acquire a new status. When food is scarce, a little farming knowledge can make a real difference.
Our mothers in the old days didn't plant in rows, but now we have learned how to do it here, and we do it at home too. That's why we like it, and because we're getting results.
So now we're teaching other people too.
The children are encouraged to use what limited resources they have to resist disease. Courses in nutrition and medicinal plants will help them stay as healthy as possible.
The kids are not only learning better farming, they are learning also it's junior farmer field and life school, what they have to do in their life, diseases, how to cope up, better nutrition, what is good food for HIV positive persons. So they all have this knowledge and they transmit the knowledge at home.
Nobody can learn on an empty stomach. So nutritious, energy-giving meals provided by the World Food Program are a vital element of the Junior Farmer Field and Life Schools. After field lessons, volunteers from the community dish out rice, beans, and fish to everybody. At harvest time, vegetables grown by the children on the school plots provide extra vitamins, as well as a sense of achievement.
In Mozambique, during one, they're always susceptible to very severe flooding. This is during one of those floods, and much of it is a floodplain, and many of the families there may be plenty of food in the country. They don't have access because they're cut off, and their own food has been destroyed, so they don't have available food, and they don't have access to other parts of the country that may have food. Food utilization, and that's the way the body makes the most of the nutrients in the food. So that's you being able to process it. If you have severely malnourished, undernourished children like this, again, if you suddenly bring in food that's very high in nutrients or a shock to their system, or they may have other things going on health-wise, parasites or disease. A longer-term recovery is absolutely essential. Okay, so when does that start then? When does the recovery start? Does that start right away with when the emergency occurs?
Not when you're pulling people out of the bubble, but
Okay.
it is a concern from the district.
Okay. Good. Other comments related to that? Yes.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Haiti as that example, I guess. You know, there's, 5,000 NGOs, and yet poverty is absolutely amazing. And I think it is because the systems there have not, the governmental system really has been disempowered by the NGOs, and also by the wealthy who take more than their fair share. And I read a book a while ago about Somalia, The Road to Hell, and it was talking about how the U.S. agricultural aid is from corporate farmers here, so free food is dumped, in this case in Somalia. The people who organize that system get paid very well, and what it really causes is corruption because the food is used by those empowered to support their own interests. And it seems to me that we don't do all that well with those two issues.
Okay.
And I'd be interested in what your viewpoint is on it.
Sure. You're absolutely right, and there's been a lot of pushback with that, and part of the thing in terms of programming with a lot of the UN agencies, and one dealing mostly with food, usually FAO's dealing on the production side and capacity building and so livelihoods. World Food Program deals primarily with the food aid, but even they are going to, so forth, that's the health aspect, that's the water and sanitation aspect. It may not just be food that's the problem here. So food utilization, you have to be able to process and use the food sufficiently. And then the last one, stability of the other three over time. So that no matter what, no matter if there's a shock in the system, you have an earthquake, you have a conflict, civil unrest, that you still have available food, you have access to it, and you're able to utilize it. So that's what it is when we talk about food security. Any questions or comments on that? Does that make sense? So looking at, going back to FAO then, relating to that, one way FAO deals with these emergencies and dealing with food security is through one of their strategic objectives, which is on resilience, which was the last one of the 5. And further elaborating on the resilience aspect, it's to enhance rural people's resilience to human and natural disasters by protecting and rehabilitating agriculture-based livelihoods. So that's pretty much in a nutshell what their programs aim to do. But why agriculture and livelihoods in emergencies? I mentioned earlier that that's their mandate. And emergencies, when we think emergency, we think life-saving, pulling people out of rubble, or emergency health or medical support, or emergency water and sanitation or shelter. Where does agriculture and livelihoods come in? Why would we even be talking about that in an